Atita, shall we start?
Yeah, we can start now.
So, a very warm good afternoon to all of you. Myself, Miss Nima, will be your host for today's session. This is our ninth lecture of the fourth season of Chrysalis. And a hearty welcome to all the esteemed guests of today's program, Professor Chaco Josby, Principal of St. Aloysius College, and Professor Betsy Palsy, Director of Research. Even in her absence, I am welcoming her. Then Dr. Achuth A, today's presenter, and Dr. Aby Abraham, our moderator. And I welcome all the participants on behalf of Chrysalis team to today's talk. With all the blessings from the Almighty, we are here to enrich you with another informative session. Chrysalis provides a platform for researchers in English literature and related domains to present their research and generate intellectual productive deliberations. Chrysalis started its journey from the academic year 2021-22, which hosted 15 paper presentations and 4 invited lectures. Academic year 2022-23 and Chrysalis 3 in the year 2023-24 widened the scope and brought its participants from across the nation. Chrysalis 4 2024-25 envisions to deepen the impact and benefit as many scholars as possible. Chrysalis in all its editions commemorates the treasured contribution of the eminent late teachers of the department, Reverend Father Anthony Kuttikat CMI, Dr. Danya Menon, and Professor Paul Davis. Today, we proudly invite our speaker, Dr. Achuth A, Assistant Professor, Department of English, St. Joseph University, Bengaluru. Dr. Achuth's research interest lies in the intersection of food, spatiality, and popular culture. He recently co-edited a book, Reimagining Marginal Experience Expression. Before joining his present position, he worked as a teacher and a research supervisor. We are also excited to have Dr. Aby Abraham, Assistant Professor, VIT AP, School of Social Science and Humanities, VIT, Andhra Pradesh. Dr. Aby's academic interest lies in the intersection of visual culture and culture studies, with a particular emphasis on the politics and power of photographic representation. An accomplished lens-based practitioner, Aby has presented lectures on photographic tests at various universities and has showcased his artistic work in numerous photographic exhibitions across India. His work was notably featured in the prestigious State Exhibition of Arts in 2022-23 organized by the Kerala Lalitakala Academy and the Department of Cultural Affairs, Government of Kerala. So, on behalf of St. Aloysius College, I proudly invite you to chair today's session on food, space, and public sphere, studying discourse on food and dining in popular media. So, I welcome you, sir, and now it's all yours.
Uh, Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Am I audible? Can hear me, right? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Right. Okay. So, good evening, everyone. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving this wonderful opportunity, and also for I would like to congratulate all of you to I mean, I understand that this is a series which we have been to see everyone here for this evening. So today we have, as Nima just introduced, we have Achuth A, who will be speaking about food space and public sphere. And I don't want to give much time, so I believe that we will have 1 hour of presentation, and then we'll have another 20 minutes of discussion, including the question and answers. I'm pretty sure that we are going to have a wonderful lecture since Achuth his PhD thesis was on public dining practice in Kerala. So without much introduction, I would like to welcome Achuth to take the dais and start the presentation. Welcome, Achuth.
Thanks, Aby, and thanks, Nima, for your introduction and for welcoming me for this brief presentation. Now, before I proceed, I should perhaps express my gratitude to Professor Chako, Professor Betsy, and the organizers for having me here for this session of Chrysalis lectures, and Atulya for coordinating everything behind the scenes. Uh, Thanks indeed for having me here for this great opportunity to share my views and through this brief presentation. Right. So for today's talk, I was hoping to look. My talk itself is titled "Food Space and the Public Sphere: Studying Discourses on Food and Dining in Popular Media." Now, I should perhaps say state at the offset that the title of this talk itself might be a little to embellish these very commonplace practices, which seem to be almost commonsensical in our mind, right? How do you find how politics matter, how social differences and demarcations are played out within this sort of mundane everyday arena? Now, one way of doing this is to look at food practices and practices of public dining in themselves as representational and discursive practices, practices which themselves act as discourses, which shape our understanding of communities, individuals, and their broader role within society. How do transformations, for instance, of various food practices provide counter-hegemonic discourses which challenge existing social norms, conventions, systems of understanding, and systems of knowledge? Right? Now, in order to do this, I had largely depended upon Stuart Hall's theoretical conceptions and methodological concerns regarding what he calls a conjunctural analysis. Now, according to Hall, as in we have a tendency to look at particular events or phenomenon in isolation, right, without really locating them historically. What Hall states is that any particular moment, particularly a pivotal ruptural moment in history, this does not exist in isolation, right? Rather, it exists as an intersection of multiple concurrent social, political, cultural, and economic factors, right? There are various contradictions within society, particularly pertaining to changes within the existing social order, which often become evident, which often come to the fore in such moments of crisis, right? And it is from these moments of crisis that one can trace possibilities of societal change and societal transformation. Therefore, for Hall, it is rather important for us to look at events not simply in isolation, but to read them as a natural progression based upon various coinciding social, cultural, political, economic factors, leading to this particular moment, which might lead to new discursive formations, right? New forms of dialogue, discussion, new forms of knowledge production, which would essentially make us think in new ways and think about the world and our position within it in entirely new, until now unthought of ways, right? Now, for this particular paper, for this particular presentation, I was hoping that instead of having a broader look, I was planning to focus upon one particular instance, one particular conjunctural moment or a conjunctural event, right? Which was Sahodaran Ayyappan's interdining feast or Mishra Bhojanam, which was conducted in Chennai in the year 1970, right? Now, this perhaps is one of the most significant and important moments within anti-caste reform movements in Kerala, particularly during the first half of the 20th century. Right? Ayyappan's interdining feast is often considered uh, a very significant intervention, which would transform caste relations in early modern Kerala, right? Particularly in the early 20th century. Now, this doesn't mean that there were not any other interdining movements in the past. Interdining, as we shall see, was something which, as a political and social movement, had been prevalent from the late 19th century, from at least the 1890s, right? But what would be of interest for me in this discussion would be to focus on why Ayyappan's interdining or Mishra Bhojanam in Chennai in 1917 is so important. What allows for this moment to become perhaps the most recognizable instance of interdining in Kerala? And how does this radically transform our understanding of caste relations? How does this function as a discursive moment, which creates new meanings, new knowledge systems, which sort of redefine uh, caste practices in Kerala, right? Now, in order to delve deeper into this, I should perhaps begin with a very brief introduction where I look at the interrelation between food and culture, right? Now, right now, it is often evident to most of us that food and culture are very closely connected and interrelated, right? Uh, we often identify various cultures based upon the food which emerges from there, right? On an everyday basis, we consume, for instance, Italian food from in the form of pizza, which we could order in, or there is a new craze for Korean or Japanese food, ways in which we associate a particular national culture with the food which is produced from there, right? But on a deeper level, it is evident to each of us that we have a deep lying affectual relationship with food. Food is one of the things which we often consider most closely associated with our memory of home. It is something which fills us with a sense of nostalgia. It is something which also is very closely related to our identity uh, as a person or an individual belonging to a specific region or a community, right? A caste community for that matter, right? Now, one of the earliest academicians or one of the earliest sociologists who had uh, focused any amount of academic interest and attention on food practices was the German sociologist George Simmel, who in the late 19th century had written a series of articles where he had looked at the sociology of food practices. Now, according to Simmel, our food and dining practices are a fecund, a fertile site for understanding social relations, right? Now, Simmel himself will point out how the consumption of food is simultaneously the most selfish and the selfless of our everyday activities, right? On the one hand, once we eat food, right, he calls it the most egotistical of all activities, right? The moment we eat food, we alienate it, right? It is unlike a cloth I wear. I can wear a shirt and I can hand it down to my younger brother, right, whom I have. I might have a pen with me, which I might use it for writing, but someday it might be stolen from me, right? But the food I consumed will be assimilated within me and it will be completely alienated from any other person in the world. And therefore, the consumption of food in itself is perhaps the most egotistical and most selfish of all activities. On the other hand, on an everyday basis, it is perhaps the most social thing that we do, right? Because while we consume food, in most situations, unless you stay alone or something, you would often have it in the company of others. In most households, most traditional households, around dinner time, the mother would essentially call other members of the family, the father, son, daughter, or anyone else, to join together at the table for dinner. Right? There is something intrinsically social about the very act of eating. Right? And Simmel points out that the very beginning of human civilization could be traced back to the moment when early humans, primitive humans, would gather around a fire after a day of hunting and gathering and nursing for that matter. And they would all share stories and share stories about themselves. They will speculate about the origin of the celestial bodies and essentially bond over this act of cooking and dining food around a fire. Simon also points out that this is truth, it is at the dining table, or it is in the process of dining that the first social rules are constructed, right? Who gets to eat first? What portion of the particular meal would be eaten by men? What will be eaten by women? How does your standing in that primordial community be reflected in the portioning that you receive of the meal, right? Or where you're seated while you consume that particular meal? Food becomes a site for acting out various social and societal hierarchies. Now, food can also become a symbolic substitute for one's culture, as had been pointed out by Ashish Nandi and Claude Levi-Strauss. Right? For Levi-Strauss, one's food culture also becomes a sign of sophistication or inferiority of the culture that one belongs to. Now, other cultural critics and scholars like Mary Douglas and Maurice Bloch had looked at how our food practices effectively act as ways of demarcating our communal boundaries, right? What we eat, and more importantly, what we should not eat, defines who we belong to as a community. It is because of this reason that most communities, essentially religious communities in particular, often have strict prescriptions as well as prohibitions regarding what meals or what meats could be consumed, right? Or whether even meat can be consumed at all, right? These become ways of marking out one's community as eaters of beef against those who do not eat beef, as eaters of pork against those who do not eat pork, and so on. Or eaters of vegetarian food as opposed to those who eat non-vegetarian food, and so on. Maurice Bloch, on the other hand, had also turned attention to how uh, our kinship, our sense of belonging, is often determined by whom we eat food with, right? The amount of food the kind of conditions in which we share food often suggest a degree of kinship and closeness with the other members with whom we have food, right? The very act of sharing food with someone, something which is called commensality, right? The act of dining together in the same space with other members is in itself an act which suggests a certain degree of kinship, belonging, and togetherness. Right? Now, authors such as Pierre Bourdieu in the 1980s in his epochal work Distinction, A Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste, had written about how our food practices and food habits, what he terms the habitus, is something which is essentially shaped based upon our social, cultural, economic, and educational capital. Right? Our food habits themselves can be read as signs of underlying societal hierarchies. Within the Indian context, writers such as Gopal Guru and Sharmila Rage had pointed out how food within the Indian context becomes a symbolic marker of one's communal identity, one's caste identity, more importantly. Caste in India is often clearly defined and demarcated through what food one consumes as a community, right? What can one eat and what one cannot eat often defines which caste community one belongs to. Now, within such a socially stratified society, this association of particular food types with particular communities also means that certain food items are often considered to be inferior and denigrated, right? And there is a close association of food in itself with ideas of ritual pollution, which often determine caste demarcation and caste differentiation, and indeed caste discrimination within Hindu society. Now, when you look at food culture in Kerala, it is very significant to look at this particular aspect, right? How various caste, the identity of various communities, particularly caste communities, are framed through extant food practices, right? Now, what kind of meals or what kind of diet is followed by the different communities, for instance? The strict orthodox vegetarianism of the Brahmin caste very evidently sets them apart from the other castes within Kerala, right? In Kerala, what is very evident is the clear absence of the two other intermediary classes cast in the Chaturvarna system, which is there elsewhere, right? The Vaishyas and the Kshatriya castes are notably absent in Kerala. And that is perhaps the reason why, apart from the Brahmins, all other communities in Kerala essentially often have the practice of eating meat, even in domestic context. Now, caste food is often closely related to the idea of caste community because, in a certain way, food is what defines the body. It is assimilated into the body, right? And within a caste society and a very entrenched caste society, as we had in Kerala during the 19th and early 20th century, this association of food with the body was really significant, right? Now, on the one hand, the eating of what was called sattvic food, right? Food which essentially was vegetarian, which did not use roots and tubers, which essentially was the food of the Brahmin caste, was seen as something which was pure and purified. While the food eaten by the lower caste and Avarnas in Kerala were often considered to be rotten and objects of pollution, right? The very consumption of this food, as well as the food touched by a caste lower than one's own, was often considered polluting to castes higher up in the order. Now, within Kerala, there is a very strange relation between caste communities, marital relationships, and food practices, right? Essentially, in Kerala, one could see that most caste communities are also commensal units, right? In the essence that people belonging to one caste community can essentially dine together, right? This leads to really, really strange developments, right? Uh, this also means that one cannot, for instance, have food with a person belonging to another caste, particularly a caste lower than one's own, right? Now, this leads to, as I mentioned, really strange conundrums and contradictions within public dining culture in Kerala. Now, to put it lightly, until the arrival of colonial modernity, till the late 19th century, there was no real secular public dining culture in Kerala because of the immense prohibition placed on interdining, right? People belonging to two castes and even subcastes could not share the same space and eat food together, right? In fact, it was considered that the saliva or the touch of an untouchable person was equivalent to food being licked by a dog, right? As in, therefore, it was always considered deeply polluting to, in fact, even consume food in the presence of someone from the lower caste, right? But the only places where there was a public dining culture were during these state-sanctioned feasts, which were held as part of temple festivals, and in Utupuras, which were inns run by the king for Brahmins to be fed, right? But even within these ceremonial feasts, which were conducted in temple festivals or within Utupuras, they had a system of people seated in pandis, right? In different lines, in different orders, where the highest caste would be seated first and would be served first, followed by subcastes in the uh, descending order of their superiority, one might say, right? Now, strangely enough, in Kerala, the logic seems to be that you can only marry someone whose food you can eat, right? Now, this would mean that food made by a person below your caste cannot be consumed by consumed by a person of a higher caste, right? But there is a strange exception here, right? Perhaps as a result of the Sambandham system which used to exist between the Nayars and the Nambudiri communities in Kerala, it is fine for Nambudiris to eat food cooked by a Nayar, right? But a Nayar cannot eat food cooked by a community below their own, like an Irava or a Pulaya or a Paraya, right? Now, on the other hand, the food cultures of communities on the lower side of the spectrum, the Avarna and the untouchable communities, were often associated with a degree of degradation and humiliation, right? Now, if you look at narratives, food narratives of the Avarna caste during this particular period, during the late 19th, early 20th century, if you go back and read autobiographies, for instance, from up to the mid 20th century, from lower caste communities in Kerala, one would often see that these narratives are replete with mentions of starvation, hunger, and so on, right? There were caste practices wherein even when lower caste members were fed food, they would never be fed food in a dish or a plate, but would often have to dig a hole in the ground, lay a banana leaf, and be fed food on the ground. Right now, we also, well until the second half of the 20th century, had in two tumbler system where people belonging to the lower caste would have a separate tumbler to drink from, as opposed to people belonging to upper caste, right? Something which is very evocatively recollected by Kallan Pukkudan in his autobiography, right? Now, on the one hand, we see here a standardization, a regularization of food practices, wherein, or rather a formalization of food practices, wherein one has a strict social hierarchy being maintained through the observance of certain patterns regarding food and dining, essentially regarding where one can, with whom one can eat food and with whom one cannot eat food, right? On the other hand, there are also communities for whom their very practices of dining are related to experiences of humiliation and abjection, right? Now, how does a community which is trying to reform itself, which is trying to stake a greater claim within this new spaces and new possibilities of representation made available through colonial modernity, refashion itself, right? How does a community stake its claim in society, uh, demand an equal standing and an equal footing within a society which is undergoing a rapid series of transformations, right? And this is where it becomes important to locate Ayyappan's interdining feast as a significant conjunctural event, right? Now, what makes this particular event happening in 1917 a significant, as I mentioned, a conjunctural moment, right? Now, in order to do this, we should perhaps historicize this moment a little bit, right? Now, Kerala society in the early decades of the 20th century was going through drastic changes, right? There were rapid social transformations happening in Kerala, especially in Travancore as well as in Kochi, right? On the one hand, there was the collapse of the traditional feudal order, right, which was built upon the Taravat system, as recollected by Robin Jeffrey in his book, The Decline of Nayar Dominance, right? So, on the one hand, you have the decline of the traditional Marimakatayam system, which leads to the decline of Nayar Taravat, right? And instead of a feudal economy, there is the slow growth of a cash-based capitalist economy by the late 19th century. Now, this is also a time when the kind of social sanctioning, right, which the upper caste, the Nayars and the Nambudiris in particular in Kerala enjoyed from the princely state, was slowly being challenged because of the presence of the British government and the British resident in Travancore and Kochi. Right now, because of the presence of missionaries, through which lower caste communities were able to get at least a limited access to education and other infrastructural resources, they also were able to sort of navigate these positions of power. Right, the presence of the British paramountcy also meant that there were slowly certain measures taken by the Travancore government and the Kochi government to sort of modernize along the lines of scientific, rationalist, and to some degree, what would you call it, secular means. Right now, along this, at the same time, uh, there were the access to education also opened up opportunities for greater employment, especially in the growing government sector, for members belonging to the lower caste. Now, one of the communities which radically and rapidly grew in stature during this particular period, from the last decade of the 19th century to the first couple of decades of the 20th century, were the Iravas, who were at that time one of the most numerically superior groups in Kerala. In terms of numbers, they were almost equal in numbers to the Nair community in Kerala. Now, because of the sheer numbers that they had in them, the Iravas were often able to negotiate and demand greater rights over the course of time. Right. For instance, by initially threatening to convert to Christianity, later to Hinduism, and then later to Islam, and finally to Buddhism. The Irava community were able to negotiate greater degrees of representation, for instance, in the government sector, right? Which led to a growth to a certain degree in the economic stature of the Irava community in southern and central Kerala. Now, however, what was evident was that this partial growth in economic status was not coupled necessarily by social mobility, right? Iravas were still, despite their ability to run mills or accrue a certain degree of capital, increasingly get to own greater amounts of land, were still considered as untouchable within the caste Hindu society, right? And the only way of breaking free of this system was to shatter the symbolic system associated with caste, right? How caste sort of sneaks its way and sort of interpolates itself into all everyday practices of common life, right? Now, if you look at various self-reform movements amongst lower caste communities, particularly amongst the Iravas of South and Central Kerala, and the Nadars and the Chanar community of southern Kerala, of the southern extreme of Kerala and Travancore, in present-day Nagarkoil as well, one would see a constant reworking of the symbolic orders, constant challenge raised against various everyday practices through which caste is reinstated into our lives, right? Now, one can see, for instance, how the ritual dominance of the Brahmin community, or the dominance of the hegemonic presence of the Brahmin community within ritual and religious practices in Kerala, was sort of shattered by the movement led by Srinarayana Guru, particularly regarding his consecration of the Irava Shiva temple at Adivikpuram, right? Now, on the other hand, we can also see ways in which sartorial practices, right, clothing and dressing practices, were challenged through the Marumarakal Samaram or through the Kallumala Samaram, right, which essentially aimed to demand rights for women within lower caste communities to cover their breasts and to not wear necklaces which were symbolic of one's caste position and hence associated with a culture of humiliation and oppression. Right now, what these practices essentially tried to do was to create a new sense of selfhood and to create citizens who had more greater modern sensibilities, or rather to drag Kerala society from a state of feudal subjecthood to a state of modern citizenry, right? Now, by the early 20th century, this movement had extended to also claiming access to common spaces and secular public spaces, right? And this, for instance, can be seen through the development of the Viking Satyagraha and the later Temple and Tree movement, which should radically reshape Kerala in the first quarter of the 20th century. Now, for our present discussion, I also feel that it is rather important to look at the rise of a print media culture and print modernity in Kerala during the latter part of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. This period of time, particularly from the 1890s onwards, sees the mushrooming of a very significant print culture in Kerala, right? And it is really striking that the growth of print culture in Kerala, particularly when it comes to the printing of non-fiction, is comparable to more metropolitan parts of the country, places like Calcutta or Bombay or Madras for that matter, right? And in many cases it overshadows the growth of print cultures in other major linguistic regions, right? Now, according to Robin Jeffrey, right from the 1890s onwards, in Kerala, print culture had moved on from what he terms the rare phase into what he terms the scarce phase, where there were almost around 30 periodicals or 30 copies of periodicals available to around every 1,000 people, right? Which is rather significant. Now, you can also see the real mushrooming of print culture in Kerala over the span of barely 3 decades, right? In 1890, according to Jeffrey, uh, there were just 10 periodicals registered in Kerala, right? Which had a total circulation of around 5,000 copies. Barely 1 decade later, in 1903, there were 16 periodicals in Kerala with a total circulation of around 11,000 copies. But by 1921, there were at least 92 registered periodicals in Kerala, and the circulation had gone past 80,000 and almost reached 1 lakh copies in circulation. Now, what is also striking here is that the print culture in Kerala went sort of hand in hand with self-reform movements among various communities in Kerala, right? This was very significantly a time when different communities were sort of consolidating and coalescing into various clear demographic units, right? In order to write to the state and claim representation through petitions and so, and submit representations through petitions and so on, right? So there was a greater aim to consolidate the community and to sort of refashion it, right? To leave behind the senses of the old and to create a new self which sort of fitted in within this new idea of modernity, right? Now, what one can see here is that almost every caste community or every organization for that matter in the early 20th century, by the 1910s in particular, had their own newspapers or periodicals, right? For instance, there would be periodicals catering purely to Arya Brahmana Sabha and so on, right? There'd be periodicals catering to Nair and even particularly for Nair women, right? There is, if you go through the archives at the Appantapura library, you would, for instance, see a magazine which is only dedicated to Mapila Mahila or the Nasrani magazine for that matter, right? We have for the Irava community the publication of magazines such as Vidavadi, right, amongst others, right? Various magazines which aim to cater to very specific caste communities. And within these caste communities, one would often see, and within these magazines rather, and these periodicals, one would often see an attempt at self-fashioning. On the one hand, these magazines would contain articles which would often offer a history of the particular caste or that particular community. There would be sections which would cater to various ceremonial practices. What are the correct rituals to be followed at times of a funeral or at times of a marriage, right? In order to sort of standardize practices across the entire region for that particular caste community. There would be also brief works of literature aimed to sort of display the growing literacy of that community and its growth in the educational sector. There would also, interestingly enough, be entire pieces dedicated to notable figures from that community. A person who is working as a barrister or who works in the kacheri would be often uh, spoken about in lengthy columns, right? Now, apart from all of these, there would also be sections which are entirely dedicated to the kind of food and dietary practices to be followed by particularly women in that community, right? Now, we see a constant development of an idea of self-fashioning happening within this newly emergent print culture in Kerala, right? Now, at the same time, these magazines were also spaces where there was a lot of debate and contestations happening, right? Every magazine would often write articles demanding greater rights for that particular caste community. They would often write very satirical articles, and one should go back and read these articles. These works are masterpieces of satire and argumentation, right? Uh, Sort of completely satirizing claims made by contesting communities, right? Who were demanding greater representation in the government and so on. There would often also be a sort of a debate happening between multiple magazines writing against one another. Now, all of this seems to hark back to the Habermasian idea of a public sphere, wherein you have the emergence of coffee houses and print culture in 17th, early 18th century Europe, where there was a where the public sphere became a space outside the authority of the church and the monarch, where the common people could come and debate and come to a common consensus, which would work towards the betterment of society. Now, what happens in Kerala during the early 20th century, particularly the first 2 to 3 decades, during the second and third decade of the 20th century, is a not so Habermasian public sphere, right? Here, like in the Habermasian public sphere, there are debates, there are discussions, there is a general, there are a constant series of disagreements which happen within the public sphere. But what is significant here is that the public sphere essentially works towards coalescing and consolidating caste communities and their demands, right? And they work towards reforming, refashioning, and self-modeling these communities into ideal subjects of this particular communal group. Now that we've located the conjectural coincidences surrounding the Cherai Mishra Bhojanam, I was hoping that we can perhaps detail, and this part might be a little bit descriptive, about the event in itself, which happened in 1917. Now, the Mishra Bhojanam event, which perhaps is considered the most significant and perhaps is the most memorialized in the history of early 20th century Kerala, is the one conducted by Sahodaran Ayyappan in Cherai in 1917. Ayyappan himself was born in 1889 in Cherai to a rather middle class, one might say, Innova family, right? He would study in an English medium school initially, and then would later go on to do his further education in Calicut and in Madras. He would also earn his bachelor's degree in Trivandrum, right? Where he would soon join the service at the government service as a teacher. It was during his time in Trivandrum that he also came into close association with Kumaran Ashan, and sort of inspired by Kumaran Ashan's activism, he would also enter the field of social activism, later meeting directly with Sridharayana Guru, and finally he began actively involved in anti-caste politics in Trivandrum, which he carried forward when he moved back to Cherai in around 1970. In Cherai, while he was working as a teacher, Sahodaran Ayyappan decided to conduct a Mishra Bhojanam, or an interdining event, an event where people from multiple different caste communities would be seated together and have a meal. and this event was planned to be held on the 29th of May 1917. Right. Apart from Ayyappan, other prominent Irava leaders in Cherai, such as K.K. Achudan, C. Keshavan, and Kochatti Ashan were also part of this group who had decided to conduct this particular event. They had essentially signed a document together and they had published handwritten notices advertising this event. Right now, Ayyappan initially wanted to conduct this event in his household itself, but his brother had apparently objected to it, saying that the Parani festival is nearby and it would offend the gods to sort of conduct an event which is so transgressive just before the festival itself. Therefore, the feast was later shifted and held at Tundare right? Now, on the day of the feast, there were, apart from Ayyappan, there were also present two prominent Irava leaders from the Iravodaya organization there by the name of V.K. Kelappan Ashan and Achuth Ashan. Right? Now, Ayyappan, to inaugurate this event, had delivered a typically fiery speech, right, explaining the need to fight caste at all levels and ask for the support of all those who believed and followed Narayana Guru to work towards achieving this goal. Right. Now, after the speech, everyone present gathered to take a pledge in which they stated, as the caste system is socially harmful and scientifically baseless, we swear to abolish it by any means without breaking the law. Right? Now, following this, everyone present in the meeting signed a particular document acting as signatories of this oath. After this, Ayyappan announced that we are going to take food along with some Pulayas who are present here, a caste lower than the Irava community than Ayyappan belonged to. And he stated that if anyone is interested in joining us, you may do so. Now, Ayyappan had invited a Pulaya laborer by the name of Pallipurathu Korasheri Ayyar and his son Kannan, right, who were present for the meal. K.K. Achudan Ashan, who was a school teacher at Cherai, had brought two Pulaya students from the school by the name of Vallon and Chatan, right, who were sort of living under his care. Now, after a bit of persuasion, these guests agreed to serve food and dine along with the other Iravas who were present and at the venue. Now, Kochatti Ashan, another prominent Irava leader at that time, presented Kannan with a new piece of cloth to wear in place of the dirty and ragged one which he was supposed to wear. After this, the Pulaya laborer Kolasheri Ayyar poured a bit of rice and porridge into his son Kannan's leaf. And after this, the same food was served to all the Iravas who were present, and they all dined together. After the meal, the Pulaya boys, Vallon and Chatan, served payasam to each of the guests, each of the diners rather. Now, one moment. Now, this appears to be innocuous in itself, but it would go on to stir a huge controversy in 1917 in central Kerala, right? And the news of this event would spread like wildfire through the newly emergent print media, which was functioning at that time, right? Now, this moment in this sense marks a very significant conjunctural event, right? Because it was a particular event which was based upon the coincidence of multiple social economic factors, as I mentioned, which sort of led to a significant rupture, a significant shattering, right? A moment of rupture which would sort of refashion the way in which we think about caste communities, the way in which we think about accessibility to public spaces, the way in which we think about public dining practices in Kerala. It is a ruptural event, particularly because it led to a series of discussions and debate, the emergence of new discourses, which would transform the entire social field in Kerala. Right? Now, to be fair, one has to point out that Ayyappan was, even though he is often most closely regarded with the practice of Mishra Bhojanam or Panthi Bhojanam as it is often called, the practice of interdining as a mode of anti-caste resistance in Kerala, he was not the first to do so, right? Ayyappan was merely borrowing from an extant tradition of using interdining as a way of challenging caste norms, which had been practiced almost for the previous 25 years or so. In the 1890s, from Trivandrum, Takyada Swamigal, had in his ashram in Metukada conducted a series of interdining feasts. In one of the feasts, it's believed that Ayyangali, the perhaps one of the most significant anti-caste reformers in Kerala, was also present, wherein he had shared food with others who were there at the wedding. In the second decade of the 20th century, during the 1910s, a series of interdining events were held by Hindu nationalist and other nationalist organizations across Kerala. For instance, RKM or Ramakrishna Mission in their ashram in Haripad had conducted one such feast. The Arya Samaj had conducted interdining events in Calicut. So did the Theosophical Society, which had conducted an interdining event in 1914, if I'm not mistaken, in Annie Hall in Calicut. Right? But what makes Sahodaran Ayyappan's event perhaps so notable and most significant was that it was an event which marked a rupture, right? Where dormant contradictions became more evident, right? If you give me a moment. Now, Stuart Hall explains as a period during which the different social, political, economic, and ideological contradictions that are at work in a society come together to give it a specific and distinctive shape. He states, history moves from one conjuncture to another rather than being in an evolutionary flow. And what drives it forward is usually a crisis, when the contradictions that are always at play in a historical moment are condensed, or as Althusser says, fused in a ruptural unity. Crises are moments of potential change, but the nature of the resolution is not given. It may be that the society moves on to another version of the same thing, or to a somewhat transformed version, or that relations can be radically transformed. Now, the intervening event at Cherai is one such moment of conjunctural crisis when existing contradictions sort of fuse together in rupture, producing new forms of knowledge, new discourses, and which leads to an awareness that subsequently transforms individual understandings and communal understandings of the self and its position within a broader society and public life in Kerala. Right? Now, Ayyappan's intervention here is not just cultural, but an intervention into culture itself. Right? As the organic relationships in a society are reshaped, it produces new forms of knowledge and awareness in the form of discourses, which are contested and negotiated in the public sphere until they come to be accepted as common sense. This is perhaps the significance of this controversial moment in Kerala history. Ayyappan's controversial interdining feast in Cherai opens up a plethora of questions, opinions, and contestations within this nascent public sphere in early 20th century Kerala. These debates and discourses further shape public opinion and reshape our dispositions towards the self in relation to broader social, political, and cultural relations. Right? Ayyappan does not aim to overthrow existing culture through one throw of the dice. Rather, his interventions lay the foundation of a critical debate which would produce new notions of body, habitus, and access to public spaces. Right? Now, what is immediately notable is that instantly after the interdining feast in Cherai, there was an acrimonious and vociferous criticism of the event, particularly from conservative members of the Irava community. Right? So, for instance, barely a week after the function, the Vijnanavardhini Sabha, a prominent Irava organization in Cherai, circulated a notice enforcing a social boycott of the 22 Irava families who had participated in the event. Right? They were excommunicated from the larger community and excluded from marriage and other social functions. barbers refused to cut their hair, and they were no longer allowed to draw water from shared resources. Ayyappan himself was targeted by members of the Irava Orthodox. During an anti-caste campaign at Muthagunnam, Kaudam was thrown at him by certain Irava lords. He was covered with an anthill in Logamalleshwaram, and on another occasion during a public meeting at Pallandirtha, he was verbally abused by members of the audience. A few of whom shouted that he should not be allowed to leave the dais alive. At Nyarakil, he barely managed to escape with his life when he was chased and stabbed by a group of Irava hooligans. Right? Now, it is striking here that in this context, Kumar Ashan, who's often seen as one of the most significant social reformers of Kerala in the early 20th century, was himself rather open about his criticism of Ayyappan, stating that even though Ayyappan might mean well, he was essentially just misleading a bunch of Veerava youth. Right? Now, perhaps as a result of all this criticism, barely 3 months later, Ayyappan would go on to publish the first edition of the magazine which he titled Sahodaran in August 1917. Right? I have come across various other sources placing the date of the publication of the Sahodaran magazine as either 1919 or 1921. But the first edition published in August 1917 is actually available at Appunapuran Library in Thrissur. Now, in this particular edition of the magazine, the first edition of Sahodaran, Ayyappan had written an editorial on the practice of interdining in itself, right? Wherein he had sort of defended his intervention in the form of Mishra Bhojanam against the sort of criticism that it has received, right? It's a stunning retort, right? Precious argumentative piece which sort of debunks the criticism of interdining as a critical and radical social practice for eradicating caste discrimination, right? Now, what I want to also draw your attention to is his choice of the term Mishra Bhojanam instead of the other commonly used term, Pandi Bhojanam, right? Now, the word Pandi Bhojanam was what was commonly used to refer to interdining until that point, right? And the word Pandi itself refers to the various lines or the various orders in which people are sort of seated during a feast, right? The Pandi itself refers to a line, and generally in ceremonial feasts in the past, these Pandis, the people would be seated in the Pandi based upon their position within the caste hierarchy, with those who are seated, those who are highest in the hierarchy being seated first and being served first, right? Now, Pandi Bhojanam itself seems to be a term which sort of draws its etymology from a practice which was essentially hierarchical in nature, right? On the other hand, Mishra Bhojanam in itself is something which suggests a kind of intermixing and intermingling, right? A miscegenation, if one might state, right? Now, one second. A miscegenation, if one might state. And in a certain sense, it's something which almost directly and drastically attacks the kind of fears of pollution which is so central in caste Hindu practices, right? In caste Hindu philosophy. Now, he in his editorial, and I shall read parts of the editorial because I think that this is a translation of my own. So I still feel that Ayyappan puts into words his arguments far more effectively than I would be able to under any circumstances. Let me just read out parts of this editorial piece to you in translation. Yeah, Ayyappan begins. Some argue that interdining serves no purpose. They feel that if a Pulaya and a Nambudiri dine together, not only would the Pulaya fail to be elevated in status, but furthermore, the Nambudiri status would be diminished. Apparently, one should not drag the Nambudri to the Pulaya's position, but should raise the Pulaya to the Nambudris. Those critics who sort of crease their brows at the very mention of interdining have not really understood its aim or function at all. Interdining is not held because it will improve the educational or economic stature of the community. Neither is its objective to lower the upper caste to the state of the caste below them. The main thrust of interdining, rather, is to serve the country by destroying caste in an entirely harmless manner. Now he continues, a small set of so-called social reformers who are guided by their own selfish motives, who speak with vigor and act differently, cannot turn to interdining to fight the caste demon. Hence they call interdiners progress fanatics, self-destructive and anti-national. There is no need to satisfy these cowards who stop from doing the right thing just because they fear a public backlash. Is there, is there any progress without conflict? There are others who feel that lower caste should slowly be allowed to walk on roads, slowly let closer, slowly lift caste restrictions, and thereby consign the lower caste to an endless cycle of reform, taking an era to even accept that they are human. We needn't address these heartless folks either. There is no point in assuming that the caste system will disappear with the accumulation of education and wealth. Is there any point in listening to these Malwell and forever later critics who would not dine with a lower caste person, who might have a MA or a BA, unless he or she picks up new habits and superstitions and imitate the masters? It is indeed necessary to create means for education and wealth for the lower caste. Interdiners are not against the creation of new schools or factories for the marginalized. But first of all, the lower caste should be provided with avenues to grow themselves. For this, the caste system, which treats them worse than animals, should disappear. He finally concludes, it is indeed surprising to see certain self-proclaimed lords of the Irava community objecting to Irava's dining with Pulayas and other castes. One really has to bow down to these gentlemen who think that it is too low to act out something good and beneficial merely because someone has done it before for the fear of being branded copycats. It would be a great blessing if those who criticize interdining spend more time comparing interdining with other means of alleviating caste distress and thought about this deeply. Now, to return to the presentation, here in this particular editorial, Southern Ayyappan essentially posits interdining as a powerful mode of social self-reform, right? And he points out how caste reform cannot be something which is slow and conservative, but has to be immediate and radical, right? This is the only way in which one can sort of overthrow and sort of completely, I would say, dismantle the symbolic order of caste. He also points out here the fact that one cannot really, he sort of points out the hypocrisy of the hypocrisy prevalent amongst the upper caste and the Iravas, who often do not necessarily even eat food with a person belonging to a lower caste, even though they might have a undergraduate or a postgraduate degree and so on. Now, what I want to focus upon here is also how this particular editorial functions as a major discursive event, leading to a series of heated debates, discussions, and rejoinders, which should fill the print media in Kerala, but over the next couple of months or couple of months leading to the very end of the year, right? Now, immediately after the publication of this article, there also came to be letters of solidarity and support extended by other members of the Irava community. For instance, C. Keshavan would express his support in the magazine Midavadi, wherein he would write, one moment, Hinduism, as Vivekananda had said, has become reduced to don't touch me and don't come near me. Several learned people had opined that there would be progress and harmony only if the situation changes. We believe that there is nothing wrong in dining with a puleya. Nowadays, when a gentleman can eat a puleya's rice at office, there is no logic in stating that others should not do the same. T.K. Madhavan, who was then the secretary of the SN Seva Sangam, expressed his praise and support in a letter to the journal Sahodharan, wherein he states, Hinduism doesn't force anyone to exhibit casteism or communal hatred. One cannot help but be distressed by the narrow-sightedness of those who continue to humiliate the noble Pulayas even in the 20th century. My best wishes to the Sahodara Sangam, which attempts to put Pulayas on an equal footing for the sake of the national good. Perhaps rather surprisingly, in late 1917, the Sahodaran also notes the proceedings of, of the Sri Samajam meeting, which was held to commemorate the 60th birthday of Travancore's king, wherein one of the speakers, Mrs. G. Krishna Pillai, says, "Weak sisters should cast aside our caste prejudices and trust freely and dine with women irrespective of their caste or religion. Moreover, we should inculcate such broad-mindedness in our children. We should ceaselessly try to spread the message of equality to every corner we can reach." Now, followed by this in 1921, Sahodar Nayappan would also approach Narayana Guru, who would publish what is considered his Mahasandesham, which was circulated during the meeting of the Sahodara Sangam in 15 May 1921. And Narayana Guru had stated in this sort of proclamation, whatever be the religion, language, or dress of human beings, their caste is the same, that of being human. So there is no harm in intermarriage and interdining. Now, I just want to conclude this discussion by stating how Ayyappan's interdining feast and the sort of debates and discourses which emerged from it became a pivotal moment in anti-caste resistance in Kerala in the early 20th century. One thing it does is that it gives rise to a new transformative discursive paradigm, a counter-hegemonic discourse which allows for the very shattering of the fundamental idea of pollution which lies at the heart of caste relations in Kerala. It also allows for the normalizing of Avarna access to shared and public spaces in Kerala, right? Now, claiming the commons not as something with a sort of a private, exclusive enclave of the Savarna caste, but something which should be equally claimed and owned by even lower caste communities in Kerala. And most importantly, this also lays the foundation of for new ways of fashioning the modern era self. Now, I think I've sort of gone beyond the time allotted. I will sort of conclude here, and if there is any clarifications that you need or anything which you want me to speak about further, please do leave questions in the chat box. Yeah.
Thank you, Achuth, for that wonderful presentation. Achuth, you clearly mentioned the historical and social conditions which led to this movement. Especially if you talk about modernity, you're talking about how printing shaped and rather helped into even to get reaction like through magazines. Since you mentioned that, I would also like to ask you like this question whether was there an immediate event? Because this is not the first time somebody conducting something of this sort, as you said. Also, if you look at the history even later, I remember I was part of this organization called Balajana Sakyam, something which is led by Manorama, and they had something similar in 1931, Pandi Bhojanam, which they called Pandi Bhojanam. So you could see a series of events where multiple organizations, and even when they talk about their own history, like they consider this as a very important thing which they did. So there is a history, as you mentioned. So I would like to know whether, for example, we are sitting in a space where we could think about railway thinking about banning meat or non-veg food from in their some of the trains, which you could see in many of the college canteens these days as well, right? I mean, and why I mentioned this too, because I believe that this was the spaces where people maybe started eating like they had to because there was a necessity to do so. So Can you think about any immediate events which may have led to this particular, mode of protest?
I think, as I mentioned previously, and thanks, Siddhi, for the question. As I mentioned previously, the interdining itself as a mode of protest was something which already was done for about 25 years prior to when the Cherai interdining feast in itself happened, right? And as you rightly pointed out, the Balajana Sakyam, the Kerala Congress Party, even the Communist Party in its early stages during the 1920s and more prominently during the 30s had conducted a series of interdining feasts, right? But we often associate the practice of Mishra Bhojanam with Sahodaran Ayyappan. And I feel that this has to do a lot because this event happened in conjunction with the arrival of a broader public sphere in Kerala, right? The broader prevalence of print culture in Kerala, wherein there also, when this event was happening, they simultaneously emerged as ways wherein one can carry on these discussions and debates which naturally arose from this rather controversial event, a space from which a new discourse could emerge, which would sort of normalize and naturalize the practice of interdining, right? Something which, again, as you rightly pointed out, took some time to eventually be sort of completely naturalized and normalized in Kerala society. Now, it is rather unfortunate, like you said, how, for instance, in railways, there are tendencies to slowly kind of eradicate non-vegetarian food, right? Now, railway stations and railway platforms and railway compartments were some of the first places where interdining actually happened, right? One important aspect is, for instance, regarding it was in railway stations and railway compartments that perhaps one of the most significant culinary practices of contemporary India really took root. The practice of drinking tea, right? Tea was a completely alien product until it started to be planted in mainland India by the mid 1800s, right? It until the early 20th century, it was not even drank commonly, even among the upper classes in India. It was only marketed in India during the First World War when it became really difficult to export tea in ships from India to Britain and to Europe, right? So it was something which was the popularity of tea drinking was something which grew because of a concerted propaganda effort by tea planters in India to create a domestic market for tea drinking. And it sort of worked because tea was a new commodity which had no caste linkages, right? It was something which could be drank by everyone in common, right? Without being tainted by caste origins. So again, I feel that in many senses, uh, the popularity of tea was also a significant conjunctural moment, which happened because of the coincidence of various historical, political, and cultural events at that particular point in time.
Right. Thank you. I mean, again, since you started speaking about tea, what about tea shops? Like how I know that you worked on a public sphere as well in terms of, and whenever we discuss about Kerala, right, something tea shops is something which keep on coming in the conversations. Was it a like caste exclusive spaces even in the beginning of 20th century? Because that's also like a time where there were certain development projects which led people to be together at least in certain spaces, right? We hear about you also spoke about separate glasses, like or separate utensils to serve tea to different people. How about these spaces?
I think to a great degree for quite some period of time, even though tea in itself was a drink which did not have caste linkages, which often could be drank by everyone, the public consumption of tea was often mediated by caste, right? During the 1920s, I believe, Ayangali had led a movement amongst agricultural laborers in Kuttanad for the very fact that they were served tea in coconut shells, right? Instead of glasses or tumblers, which could be used by others, right? We saw the practice of a two tumbler system well into the 1950s, right? Kallan Pukkudan in his autobiography, for instance, clearly talks about how an Irava tea shop, in fact, in his locality would often have separate tumblers, one to be used by the Nayars and the Iravas, and another to be used by lower caste communities like the Pulyas and the Parayas, right? So that sort of even these spaces which seemingly appear modern, right, were still in some senses negotiated in and shaped by underlying systems of caste prejudice.
So my last question, maybe it's a little digression from what we discussed. What about the food which is served? Like, was there a mention about what are the dishes they served? Because again, like I study. I mean, I work in a university outside Kerala, and when we studied in these places, there are certain things which are identified as Malayali. For example, Sadhya. But when I was going through a lot of magazines, especially the early 20th century magazines, you could see, I'm pretty sure that you must have also noticed, there are a lot of reference towards, the food in general, like, and different kind of even cooking styles and all. It was also part of the beginning of, part of this magazine. So I also believe that if there is a mention about what kind of food was served, that also could work as like a kind of a evidence for what at least for the tradition or the history which we had in this period, I believe. So I was just curious, at least. Yeah.
I think there are sparse records regarding what food exactly was served, right?
Mm.
Some state that it was just some vegetarian dish with rice. Others state that it was kanni, and at the end, payasam was served,
Mm.
right? So there is no clear record as to what food essentially was served during the feast or during the event in itself.
Mm.
Now, if one has to look back at it, even after the consecration of the temple at Arivikara by no Arivipuram, sorry,
Mm.
by Sridharana Guru, the SNDP in itself traces its origin back to the Vavoti Yogam, right? Now, during all full moon days, there was a feast which was arranged at the temple at Arivipuram, right? Now, during this feast, apparently, the food which was served evidently was vegetarian food. Now, this is again a way of sort of recasting the Irava self in itself, right? Now, prior to this, until the mid 19th century, we can see various colonial accounts wherein we are given descriptions of ritual practices within Irava coils, right? Which often included the sacrifice of animals and the consumption of non-vegetarian food, right? Now, this was a way of perhaps remodeling and refashioning the Irava self in order to get greater degree of acceptance by other communal groups.
Right. Thank you, Achuth. There are a few questions in the comment section. Should I read it? Okay, so
Yeah,
Sri would like to, maybe can suggest a few books, academics books related to food in public sphere, especially in digital space. So I think that's a inquiry regarding the some of the references you could provide. But Mohammed Salim has asked a question regarding whether um, do you interpret Pradeep and Pamrikun's Eri as a modern text that narrates people were divided on the basis of their diet and still assume that superior to others on the basis of food? So he's also asking why the subaltern classes like Dalits and Adivasis didn't have revolutionary periodicals in the course of Kerala Renaissance. There are like two separate questions, but yeah.
all right. I'll first answer Sri's question. As in Sri, I would not be able to honestly recommend texts regarding food in the digital space, right? But regarding reading materials on Sahodaran Ayyappan's Mishra Bhojanam, I would always say a good starting point is to look at archival records in itself, which would be available at Appandambura Library. Apart from this, there is a book or a biography of Sahodaran Ayyappan. It's written by Ajay Shekhar. There is also a PhD thesis, I believe, written by Kuchikrishnan, which also focuses upon Sahodar Nayyappan's social reform movements. I hope these three sources are something which you can look at. Uh, Moving on to Mohammed Salim's question. Mohammed Salim, I would need some context regarding Pradevan Parabikunna's Arib. I had not read this text. If you can give me some context, I could perhaps respond to it.
Mohammed, if you are there, you can switch on the mic and ask the question directly.
Good evening, sir. My question is that especially Dalits are born to eat the subaltern food when the elite class, they are by birth have the right to eat the elite food. Okay, the Dalits and the subaltern people are born to eat the dead food, the corpses of cows and the dead animals. They are destined to eat that. And
Yes, yeah.
through the narratives of that text, we can read that. And the people like Dalit writers like Pradeepan Bhai Berikund still thinks that they are destined to be subalterns. They are discriminated in the name of their diet, in the name of their food, not only in their caste. And I think there is still a division of people in the name of food. And I think that is the basic context of every the modern context. That is my simple question, sir. And then the second question that I have mentioned there, when we read the Kerala Renaissance, you have mentioned the many people like Sahodar Nayyappan and many writers, periodicals. But when we analyze the history of Kerala Renaissance, we cannot find so many writings, revolutionary writings or periodicals in the name of Adivasis and Dalits. What was the context? What was the reason behind it? We still speak about Ayangali, Pandit Karupan, and many others, but we cannot find when we read about the periodicals and newspapers and other writings in the case of Dalits and other subalterns like Adivasis. Thank you, sir. Your discussion was very profound and very inspiring. It is still relevant. Thank you for your inspiring, resourceful talk.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, with regard to the first question, as in when you go back and read histories of food narratives, right, particularly among the Dalit caste, there are two things which stand out. The first is, of course, as you had rightly pointed out, the prevalence of eating dead carcasses, right? Something which was so central to Dalit dietary practices, right? And this is something which led, in a sense, to the very idea of pollution associated with Dalit bodies, right? This is something which also Dr. Ambedkar speaks about uh, with regard to untouchability and the cow. In his essay, The Untouchability and the Dead Cow. Now, the kind of way in which food practices of a community get denigrated is something which cannot be sort of wiped clean immediately, right? It hands on in the sense of a certain degree of prejudice. It is often sort of juxtaposed against the food practices of dominant communities, which become identified as the food of the region. I think this is something which Aby was also alluding to, how eventually what is essentially a very upper caste Savarna dish like a vegetarian sadhya would become the quintessential dish of Kerala, while other diverse food practices are completely sort of left outside the picture. Now, I think the second question that you asked is really valid and really significant, right? The absence of revolutionary periodicals by Dalit and Adivasi activists. Now, I have not researched on this, so I cannot say anything authoritatively on this fact. But I think there is a certain reason why the Iravas were also able to access a certain degree of economic and social mobility. The first is the fact that they were a sort of intermediary class. They were tenant farmers instead of agricultural laborers in many cases. Many of them had limited access to land and capital. Many of them already had functioned as accountants or vaidyas or physicians in the past. And a few of them did have a certain degree of social and economic capital. But more importantly, they were numerically, they were very large in number demographically, right? This perhaps allowed for and due to this, they were able to some degree to get a certain degree of economic mobility, gets greater representation within the educational field, which perhaps might have led to the presence of a greater reading public within the Irava community. Now, the rates of literacy amongst the Dalit and Adivasi communities in Kerala were abysmally low, even post-independence, right? Now, whether they could have comprised the significant subscriber base for circulation of Dalit Adivasi periodicals is questionable, I guess, right? As in, if such magazines were in fact published, would there even have been a dedicated readership for it? Is something which I wonder. And even the access to publishing this, the kind of capital which has to go behind funding, significant.
Right. So there's a question by
Teja has asked a question regarding globalization threatening the preservation of traditional food culture. Now, I am always suspicious of terms like traditional food culture because food cultures are always in a state of flux, right? For instance, what we assume as traditional is something which often, in many cases, has a very recent history, right? Now, food culture, as in food like stories and like any other commodities, are constantly traveling from one place to another, and they constantly influence our culinary traditions, right? And we constantly adapt as well. I would say that the emergence of this entire field of global cuisine and very localized and ethnic cuisine, so to say, has led to a greater territorialization of our food culture as well, right? Earlier, people would not. I think Teja is from Nagaland, I believe. Now, earlier, a Naga person might not think about going to a restaurant which serves Naga food, right? But right now, that might be a common practice. Now, even in Kerala, someone might go to a restaurant which serves Nadan food, right? Earlier, such a marker regarding such as Nadan or ethnic was not required, right? Because this is food which you cook at home. But when global food cultures enter your space, right, you also become a little bit more protective about and conservative about your food practices, which you try to also make more popular, make more accessible. You try to globalize your local food cultures as well, right? And I generally think that this whole idea about traditional food culture is generally problematic, I feel.
One question by Shruti regarding how we can connect it to this popular media.
Yeah, Shruti, first, I have to make a sort of an apology if the title of the talk was misleading. I initially did plan to extend this talk to encompass other aspects of popular media, specifically looking at film and film representations of food cultures, particularly in post-2000 films in Kerala. Now, I would say that food constantly occupies a sort of, until recently, a hidden space within our everyday popular culture, popular media in Kerala. Now, one could perhaps look at films and try to see how uh, in movies, at least prior to the 20th century, prior to the 2000s, food is often only displayed, for instance, within very domestic contexts, right? Where you might see glimpses of the kitchen where the mother is cooking food while others walk around or something, or where the men of the family are sitting and food is served by the women in the family, right? What sort of gender roles, gender performances become evident in such representations of food practices, right? The other space where food is always shown within Malayalam films is in tea shops, right? Which remain a largely masculine space, right? I think one way of looking at food in popular Malayalam cinema would be to look at how gendered these representations are. On the other hand, one can also look at the construction of communal identities, the construction of a certain idea of domesticities, which emerged through uh, cooking recipes, for instance, or cookbooks, or specifically cooking recipes as they appear in women's magazines, right? Again, something which can really be looked at in detail. Now, in online spaces, you would see a rather a great growth uh, in the representation of food, right? Someone called Alexander Cockburn had sort of referred to this over aestheticization of food practices as something which he terms as food porn, right? Now, how does social media generally lead to an aestheticization of food practices? How do we consume food without really tasting food or smelling food or touching food? And these are the three senses which are traditionally activated while you eat food. What are the new sensoriums which are produced in social media? Now, how do these new sensoriums sort of connect to extend stereotypical understandings of food and culture, right? So, how do we make sense of taste in a food if taste is only physical, right? Or is taste something entirely cultural, something which is only accessible to you if you have a code to decode the representation of food?
Organizers, do we have time to take one more question? Nima?
Yes, sir. You can.
Achuth, there are a few more questions there. Okay. I think you have taken the globalization question, right? I mean,
Yeah, I have taken the globalization
so
questions.
there's one more question regarding current situation in Kerala, and also Dr. Sharada is asking, what you eat define what you are. So, what is your
Yeah, I
opinion
think
regarding
this
this?
is a very, very I think most studies in food culture begin with this quote by Brillat Savant. I believe this 18th century Goma from France, right, who said that you are what you eat, right? Uh, it's very significant, as in whether it's on a very literal basis where what you eat becomes you, right? You assimilate and it becomes part of you. But more importantly, essentially, what you eat defines you as an individual. And for me, I would state that it defines your cultural location, it defines your identity within a larger social group. So, of course, so I do feel that is very true.
Also, it is taken out of context in many times to say that, yeah, like you can become
Yeah.
violent by eating food as well, like, for example, yeah. So with that thought, I think we can finish the session. For more questions, I think if you permit,
Hello.
okay, Sri has a question.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah, I
can
was
I get
going to,
can
yeah,
I get Achyut's email ID because I am also presenting a few papers on food studies and cultural studies. So I would really like to get in touch with him for some kind of discussions. Is it possible to share Achyut's email ID, please?
so I was getting there. So those who have further questions, can write to him if you agree to share the email ID. You can write directly to him. Achut, if you can share the email ID.
Shall do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Um, yeah. So I would like to give the dice to back to the organizers. Thank you, Achut, for that wonderful presentation and for giving answers to all the questions as well. Thank you.
Simi, thanks everyone for joining in for this session. It was really having these conversations, really great having these conversations with you. Thanks again.
Thank you.
So thank you, sir. Thank you, Achuth sir and Dr. Aby, for having a wonderful session here. So now for the audience, there is a feedback link in the chat box. Please do submit it to generate your e-certificates. Now I request Ms. Shruti, research scholar from St. Aloysius College, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Nima. Good evening, everyone. As we conclude this ninth lecture of Chrysalis Season 4, it is my privilege to extend our heartfelt gratitude to all who made this event possible. First and foremost, I express my sincere thanks to our distinguished moderator, Dr. Aby Abraham, for skillfully steering the discussion and adding depth to the discourse. A special thank, a special thank you to our esteemed presenter, Dr. Achuth A, for delivering an engaging and thought-provoking lecture that enriched our understanding of food, space, and the public sphere in popular media. Our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Chakojus P., our principal, for his unwavering support and encouragement, and to Professor Dr. Betsy Polsey, Director of the Research Center in English, for her constant guidance and vision in fostering academic discussion like this. We are grateful to Dr. Adita K. Unni, our program coordinator, for her planning and coordinating this session. A warm appreciation to Nima AM for ensuring the smooth flow of the event. Lastly, a big thank you to all the participants for your enthusiasm and active engagement, which made this session truly meaningful. With that, we formally conclude today's lecture. Wishing you all a wonderful evening ahead.
Thank you.
So once again, on behalf of St. Aloysius College and the whole Chrysalis team, we would like to thank everyone for your valuable time and cooperation. So
Yes.
see you soon in an upcoming session. Thank you.
Sure. Also,
So,
many thanks to Dr. Betsy and Dr. Aditya and other organizers for this wonderful session. Thank you. Have a nice day.
It's great that you got going here. So wish you all the best in all the upcoming lectures and everything else.
Thank you.
thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.